Yes.
Can you talk about the purchase of and then freeing of the slaves in the District of Columbia by the federal government at what were market rates? How was that done? And, you know, what happened with these freed slaves?
The District of Columbia emancipation is sui generis. It happens nowhere else. It's the only time or place during the Civil War where slave owners are compensated, and it has to do with the peculiar legal status that is under the Republican Party understanding of their authority and who can and cannot create slavery. Only local authorities can create slavery. They don't like the fact that the local authority over the District of Columbia, which is Congress, created slavery. But it did. Now it's going to uncreate slavery, and to do it, they have to compensate the owners. They don't like it. They're holding their nose all the way through it. But it's only a few thousand slaves. They pay $300 per head on average or something like that. And the government, under the terms of the law, Lincoln signs that he is required to establish a commission that's going to see you have to be a loyal slave owner, you have to prove your loyalty, you have to prove ownership. And they do their work very efficiently and very effectively, and within about a year or so they finish their final report and issue it and say, you know, we have freed 1,822 slaves or something.
So
like
wasn't there any, agitation from other persons to get similar payment?
The border states wanted it.
Yeah.
No, actually, I shouldn't say.
No.
What's that?
They didn't.
They didn't
The
get
border
it.
states didn't want
They wouldn't give up their slaves.
Well, this is what I was going to say. The border states wanted it by, like, 1864, when they realized they weren't going to get anything. They started saying, well, are we going to get compensated? And by then it was like, no, my dead body. There's no way at that point. We gave you the chance. You know. But the compensation issue is interesting mostly because by then they had already been emancipating slaves militarily without compensation. Or without, you know, it's a tiny number that are there. It's sort of the exception that proves the rule, right? They never compensate. They don't like the idea of compensation. They only did it in Washington, D.C. for very specific reasons having to do with the bizarre
But the
legal
idea
structure.
of my government purchasing human flesh is just, you know, really...
Well, they purchased them in order to free them.
I understand, but
Well,
still
Frederick
putting
Douglass
a value
didn't mind
on
it. Frederick, I mean, come on, you got my position is do whatever you have to do to get them freed. If that's what it takes, free them. Then free them. I'm not too worried about that. This was Frederick Douglass' position, right? When he's in England and he can't come back because he's the runaway slave, and his benefactors in England pay for him. And William Lloyd Garrison has a fit, saying, "Oh, you can't pay for human flesh." And Frederick Douglass is like, "Give me a break. You know? Get me free, and then we'll talk about it." But that's the way I feel about it. You know, get them free, and then we can complain about how they did it, whether they did it the right way or the wrong way.
One more question.
Okay.
You're the last question.
Okay, just a couple of comments now.
Sure.
One of the other things the Emancipation Proclamation did in the enticement, obviously we discussed how it enticed slaves in the South and what have you, but it also gave authorization for the enticement or recruitment of free blacks in the North.
That's correct.
That was the authorization that Governor Andrew of Massachusetts had
Yes.
when he recruited the 54th Massachusetts.
That's right.
And others in the 29th Connecticut.
Yes.
And one other comment talking about social equality. Of all those tens of thousands of blacks that followed Sherman through the March from the Sea, when it came time at the end of the war, and they had the grand review of the Union Army, not one single black person was allowed to march with us.
That's right. That's right. That's right. These are, as I was saying, these are not 20th century civil rights era egalitarians we're talking about. But on the other hand, we're talking about people who, you know, they were 19th century racial egalitarians in the sense that there was a huge fight in the middle of the 19th century over questions that were thrown up by the slavery debate, but which were about race. For example, if you asked Northerners, do you believe that the promise of fundamental human equality in the Declaration of Independence applies equally to whites and blacks alike? You'd get a huge conflict, because Republicans would say yes, and Democrats would say no. If you ask them, do you believe that whites and blacks are equally entitled to the fruits of their labor? Republicans would say yes, and Democrats would say no. If you ask, do you believe whites and blacks are equally entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizenship? Republicans would say yes, and Democrats would say no. If, on the other hand, you said, should whites and blacks be allowed to marry? Should whites and blacks be allowed to vote equally? Should whites and blacks? Those questions you wouldn't get that kind of conflict. But on some very important questions, there was a certain element of racial egalitarianism that was a very important part of this 19th century politics. Not what we consider, not anything close to what we consider adequate, but there, and very important too.
We don't have to talk about women that do it.
You're not even...
Yeah, we don't
Not
have
even an issue. Not that it should, I mean...
Well, the Emancipation Proclamation did deal with women. The Confiscation Acts didn't, if I'm not mistaken.
No, the only time the issue of women really shows up in Emancipation where there's a gender. Yes, Emancipation Proclamation applies men, women, and children. Confiscation Act, it's no distinction between men and the 13th Amendment doesn't only free men, it frees men and women. So the gender, but there is an issue when you start admitting blacks men into the Union Army, where up until that point, men and women had been coming into Union camps, offering their services to the Union Army and getting paid wages. Men would do certain kinds of labor, women would work for the Army as cooks or seamstresses, right? But those people are freed and understood to be freed because they had given service to the Union Army. But once you let men into the Union Army, then you have a gender distinction, and then they put into the law that says, the Militia Act that allows blacks to be enlisted in the Union Army also says the wives, mothers, and children of the soldier will also be freed, right? They're trying, now that's the first time you get a kind of gender distinction in emancipation, but it's actually an attempt to expand emancipation, not restrict it. It's part of they're passing a million different laws to try to get as many as they can.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Sure.